Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Laats. I'm a historian at Binghamton University, upstate New York, in the SUNY system. My work, I've looked a lot at the history of religion in schools. These days, I'm just finishing a book about the very earliest public schools in U.S. cities, started by one of the folks that Dr. Komline looks at in his book, which we'll be talking about today, Joseph Lancaster. So I'm very excited to hear more about the Common School Awakening. And then I'll pass it to you. Why don't you tell the people, David, about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. I'm David Komline, and I'm excited to be here. I am the author of The Common School Awakening, Religion and the Transatlantic Roots of American Public Education, which came out with OUP in 2020. And it's a revision of a dissertation that I wrote at Notre Dame and defended in 2015. I'm currently an associate professor at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, where I teach surveys and electives on American religion, especially.
Yeah, and Professor Komline is taking his family to do something that the people that he studied 200 years ago also did, which is, as he mentioned, this is a transatlantic story, and it's a multiple sites story in Europe as well. So could we start with that? The folks that you study, they weren't just interested in Europe, they were fascinated, they were obsessed. I don't know if that's too strong a word, but can you tell us something about the transatlantic angle of this generation of school reformers?
Yeah, awesome. Let's do this in several ways. Yeah, so in a little less than 2 weeks, I'm going to Germany for a year-long sabbatical with a grant from the Humboldt Foundation, which I'm very excited for. This will be the third time that I've spent an academic year in Germany. I spent an academic year there in 2013 to 14 on a Fulbright when I was writing this book, this dissertation. And I also spent an academic year 2008, 2009 on a grant from the DAAD, the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst. And those years there were really important for my own scholarly journey and for coming to this book. So we'll go there and then we'll move to the subjects of the book themselves. But I spent a first year in Tübingen, 2008, 2009, really just because I was looking for a way to go to Germany. My wife, who also teaches with me at the seminary here and is an expert in early Christian studies, wanted to go to Germany. So I tried to find a way to go along with her, and I got funding to do a project there. And I spent a lot of time during that year learning German. And so I went from there to Notre Dame to start my PhD. And I really wanted to use this tool, the skill that I had just invested a lot of effort in my doctoral studies. So I was at Notre Dame looking around. I knew I wanted to write something on American religion. And I was just exploring ways to find, people a way that German would be helpful there, really. And so I was reading a lot of different stuff. And I read the prominent book, so Atlantic Crossings by Daniel, blank his name, at Princeton. It's a prominent book.
Yeah, Rogers.
Rogers, thank you, Daniel Rogers, right. And that was a great book, and I was just looking around at things in there, and came across this series of people who traveled to Germany and to Europe. And so Rogers has this argument that there's actually this kind of what I call a Sonderzeit. It's a special time in American history where Americans are looking abroad for inspiration in social reform. And the Rogers book is amazing. I don't think there's actually a Sonderzeit. I think Americans are always looking abroad. And so I saw his call for papers on Rogers's book for a conference, and I was like, I've got this idea. I've been looking at these people who are trying to go abroad, and so I wrote this paper that came out in a book called Transatlantic Social Politics on educational reformers from the 1820s and 30s who traveled to Germany. And that paper became the basis of this dissertation. That paper didn't really look at religion because I was sort of in the Rogers mindset at the time. And it was just something that I came across. And so I did it. And the paper was well received. And people at Notre Dame started pushing me to think, hey, I could keep going with this. I was thinking about a really different topic, still in educational history, but looking more at universities. But people said, think about this earlier schooling. So I started running with it. And all these people that I was talking about who had traveled to Germany, looking at schooling, were also, for the most part, actually clergy people, or they were somehow highly religious. And so I started thinking about how to add that to the narrative. And then I started writing the book, went back to Germany again on a Fulbright in 2013, 14. Spent that in Heidelberg, which is where I'll be stationed this year again, and completed the dissertation. So that's my sort of background, personal narrative, Germany things. And I kind of wrote this book really because I was just looking for a way to use German history in my research. And I've really enjoyed the process of writing the book and what I found. And so now I'll turn and look at the book itself and the people who are in there going to Germany and going abroad. And I think there's so one of the major themes of the book is that people travel to Europe and look at schooling in Europe and different models of schooling, and they look at all sorts of models, and they don't always do it for the same reasons or the same intentions in mind when they travel abroad. So sometimes people travel abroad because they're sick and they just want to convalesce and get better, and they happen to be over there and they look at schools. Sometimes people travel abroad very intentionally trying to learn one single thing. So Thomas Gallaudet travels to first England and then to France, trying to learn how to teach deaf people in whatever is best for them. And sometimes people travel abroad for their own education because they are studying for whatever they want to study in university or beyond. But they're all then highly influenced and impacted by this time abroad. And when they return, they take what they've learned in Europe and they put it into practice in America. And this happens really across the board in numerous educational settings in America. So chapter 2 looks at different kinds of schooling in America. It looks at schooling for the elite, schooling for women, schooling for the people who are deaf and people who are blind. And in all of these areas, the sort of the foundational figures were inspired by trips abroad and learning about pedagogy abroad. And then the sort of major impetus for the educational models that are most commonly associated with the Common School Awakening for public schooling, for teacher education, for state involvement in bureaucracy, also come from Europe, from people who travel to Europe and are somehow inspired to come back to the States and implement similar reforms in Europe that they see in America.
Well, and some of them are very well known. Like Horace Mann famously is fascinated by the Prussian system, but he's not a bit player in the book, but he's not the central figure by any means. So some of the other names are maybe less well known. Maybe they don't have as many elementary schools named after them, like John Griscom, for example. Grisham, I'm not sure how they pronounced it, but he not only studied, but he was publishing about this whole the system, what it could mean for America, but also as a sort of travel story. So as Horace Mann's there, he's not the main, not character, he's not the main figure in this story. So why do you think when you got into the real story, what you were most interested in about this transatlantic story, why did Mann's most famous Prussian experience dwindle relative to these other figures?
Yeah, great, thanks. So Horace Mann obviously is sort of the major figure in most narratives about common schooling in America. And if you look at the major textbooks in schooling in America, they'll have a section that begins with Horace Mann in the common schools. But I think when you just start with Horace Mann, you're missing a major part of the question. So Horace Mann gets a job that is given to him by the state of Massachusetts. He wasn't looking for this job, and the job pre-existed him. He was the first person to fill it, but the job was created by the government, by the state legislature. And so the question for me then became, well, how did he get this job? Or why did it come to be that there was a job that he could fill at all? And that's sort of the story that my book tells, if Horace Mann is the symbol of the common school awakening, insofar as he represents state involvement in local schools and teacher training programs and things like that, okay, I can see that as a symbol, but still, how did that symbol come to be? And that's the story that hasn't really been told at all. And that's the story that I'm telling here. So Horace Mann does go to Germany, goes to Prussia in the 1840s, really after the major push for school reform is over, I think, in many ways, after most states have decided what they're going to do in reaction to this movement for common schools. So Mann's trip to Prussia does appear in my book in the epilogue at the end when we're sort of wrapping things down. But there are lots of other figures who traveled to Germany beforehand. So yeah, John Griscom travels early on in the movement in the 1820s. And he's the one who goes over to convalesce just to get better. But then while he's there, he gets inspired and he starts traveling, and he visits all sorts of schools and comes back and publishes a travelogue, really a narrative of his time abroad that people pick up and read. And that's one of the major inspirations for sending other people abroad, send people like Gallaudet and later on Calvin Stowe in Ohio, and others as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned Ohio. The U.S. is unusual, and this is well known because it has so many, not one school system for the country, but it has, state by state, but then district by district. And so then you look at not just Ohio, but other states as well. Do you think that it even makes, it's a movement in terms of these state leaders and local leaders having similar sorts of ideas, but do you think it's more helpful to think of this as a national story, a US story, an international story, a transatlantic story, or maybe, I don't know, a bunch of transatlantic stories? How did Ohio learn from Europe? How did Massachusetts learn from Europe? Do you think there's one way that you think about this and that you approach it in the book?
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, I think you can tell the story on all those levels, and the book does so. The book does tell the story on state levels, and it focuses in that instance on Ohio and Massachusetts. But it tries to say that this is not simply a state level story. This is a national story. And so I reference other areas frequently, especially, so there's 4 chapters, two on Ohio and 2 on Massachusetts, but then there are other chapters that treat other developments, and those just look whatever's relevant from the country gets in, whatever state it may be, which are largely in the north, but not exclusively in the north. And in the epilogue to the book, I once again say this is a national story, and there are similar developments that are occurring in the South and in the West. In my early plans for this book, it was going to be even larger, and I actually sort of did all the research for a chapter on Virginia. I just didn't get around to writing it, and so then I dramatically condensed that research and put it in the epilogue. But there could be a very similar story in Virginia, not with the same ending, but with a very similar plot that would follow all the developments that you're seeing elsewhere. So I think this is a story that I think stories are very well told on a local level when we have particular people doing particular things, and you see that on a state level. But we see similar stories being told, similar stories that could be told in numerous states. And when you put them all together, I think you do get a national story. But part of those stories on each state level is that people are going abroad. And so that makes this into a transatlantic story in lots of ways. And in the book, it's mostly Americans who travel to Europe to study things. But it starts in chapter 1 with Joseph Lancaster, and the figure that you're looking at, who's someone from Britain who comes to America. And there's still Americans who are interested. There are Americans who are writing to Lancaster before he comes to America. There are Americans who are reading about Lancaster and implementing his reforms before he comes to America. But he does come to America. So there is a back and forth, although the thrust of the narrative is Americans who travel to Europe. Also later on, there's a Nicholas Heinrich Julius is another German Prussian who travels to America. So there's back and forth, but the book, while transatlantic in scope, is focused on America. That's my own area of expertise.
Right, and not only transatlantic, national, state, and local, but also eternal. Now your title is 100 years old, from a reformer who was fairly secular himself. Elwood Cubberley at Stanford wasn't really interested in spreading the religious gospel, but he was interested in spreading the public school gospel.
Yeah.
So it's you make a great double movement of this common school awakening. In the 1800s, it is about Jesus, at least in some part. In the 1900s, Elwood Cubberley uses the phrase more about the common school part. What do you see the relationship? Why did you pick the title, for one? And then do you think of this as a religious revival? Or do you think of this as something new, something about state power and religious power?
Yeah. So the title for the book, The Common School Awakening, is something that I draw from Elwood Cubberley, and he uses this phrase in his most famous book from 1919 called, I should know the title, Public Education in the United States. And Cubberley is sort of in many ways, the founder of American educational history. And he just has a passing reference to the Common School Awakening. And he loves common schools and thinks that they're all about spreading American democracy across the country. So I was reading his books early in this process and came across the phrase, and I loved it because the awakening term obviously is a term that comes from religious history. In American religious history, there's discussion of the First Great Awakening, and some people talk about a Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening, while much more diffuse and ambiguous, we're not really sure what it is nearly as well as the First Great Awakening. And both awakenings have been under attack. We're not sure they're awakenings at all, but there's still helpful terms to think about large movements. And the Second Great Awakening really corresponds in time pretty much exactly with what I'm seeing in common schools. So Second Great Awakening is sort of starts with a revival in Cane Ridge, perhaps, and then spreads beyond, and we get the creation of numerous societies that try to spread the gospel throughout the country through printing Bibles or spreading missionaries, and we get the growth of what people call the benevolent empire. And all of these developments are associated broadly with the Second Great Awakening in a time period that corresponds pretty much exactly with the Common School Awakening I'm talking about. So that there are these trends that are occurring in the country religiously that are also occurring in schooling at the same time period. And I think it's very helpful and appropriate to look at the schooling development as an outgrowth of this Second Great Awakening. The same things that were associated with the Second Great Awakening, these societies are also, there's societies for publishing the Bibles, but they're also societies for forming schools, and they're being formed by the same people. It's the same religious figures, the same religious actors who are forming Bible societies, who also form school societies and attend these meetings in schools. And they're really, I think their initial goal in the 1820s and 1830s, early on in the 1830s, is to spread the gospel. They want people to learn to read and to encounter Christ through the Bible. And so that's why they initially think that public schools would be great. And then the narrative about the Second Great Awakening in religious history, that narrative often has that awakening breaking down towards the end of the 1830s, when religious actors sort of start to fall apart, and we get tensions, north-south tensions over slavery are starting to heighten, and tensions over the place of revivalism versus other ways of doing religious services start to appear much more prominently, and denominations start to break apart. So the Presbyterians split in 1837 between the New School and the Old School, and Baptists are going to split, and other groups are going to split. And so the Second Great Awakening in religious historiography sort of ends right around that time period, which is exactly, I think, when the Common School Awakening is also fracturing. And the argument of the book says that the Common School Awakening was incredibly powerful for about 30 years, and was powerful enough to bring into to create the foundations of what we might call our modern school system, with state bureaucracies and teacher training colleges. And right after doing so, the forces that had brought those reformers together sort of collapsed, and we still had these state-sponsored teacher training colleges. We still had these state positions like the one that Horace Mann stepped into, but we no longer had the same religious fervor supporting them or behind them. And so eventually a new logic for these institutions stepped in. And instead of these institutions being about helping spread the gospel through teaching people to read the Bible, they became about helping people to assimilate into American culture by helping them function in the workplace or in factories or things like that.
Right. And so in every generation, this I don't know if that's the right term, but this faith in the power of school, it includes, for most generations, at least in the 1800s, like what 21st century historians would call maybe pan-Protestant religious faith as well, in an unquestioned way. You know, this gospel of literacy is incredibly powerful for reformers. The assumption is that children left on their own can grow in malignant directions, dangerous directions. They can become thieves and hoodlums and prostitutes. But safely nurtured, they can become everything, you know, for their own good and for the society's good. So the idea of actual literacy, you know, like limited literacy, reading, writing, numeracy, was sort of salvific, you know, like if we can get schools to all the kids, we can save them from lives of crime. But in ways I think that are different than 21st century norms, even late 20th century norms, there were fewer distinctions between that kind of salvation and like religious salvation, you know, like we're going to teach them both to read and, you know, religiosity. Could you talk a little bit of the folks that you read? A lot of them weren't explicit, like John Griscom was not thinking of himself as a religious missionary. And yet his assumptions about school included a lot more, religion and than 21st century folks would. Could you talk a bit about the folks that you studied, Gallaudet and others, included religion in what they just assumed would be like the proper education of a young person would include some sort of religion?
Yeah. I think there's two parts of it here. So with Griscom and Gallaudet, I think so. Gallaudet, for instance, is a Quaker, and sorry, Griscom, for instance, is a Quaker, and I think his Quaker spirituality really just infused what he did, and so he did not think of himself as a religious missionary or even a religious figure. He wasn't ordained. He was a teacher. That was his primary function and calling. But in society at the time, his religion was just incredibly important. It was not a separate part of who he was. It was just something that he did. For Gallaudet, I think Gallaudet actually was more of a religious figure distinctly, and thought of himself in that way. And he had been to seminary and would eventually be ordained. And really, when he goes abroad to study deaf education, he does that, I think, with one person in mind, one person that he wants to hear the gospel. And he is very interested in making sure that deaf people can hear the gospel in whatever way they would do that. And there are people, so he's probably actually the most religious figure in some ways. So the person who approaches education with the most distinctly religious mindset and vocabulary throughout the book, which is interesting because he also is actually probably the person who appears in the most chapters of the book. He's not often thought of as a major educational reformer, or obviously a major figure in deaf education, but he really has his hands in sort of everything that's going on. People are talking to him a lot, and he's talking to them a lot. And so he is interacting with the people in Massachusetts, although he's not from Massachusetts. He's interacting with people in Ohio. He's not from Ohio. He's writing to people up and down across the United States. And he does, I think, have the most religious approach to this, even more so than other people who are clergymen. So the key figure in my second chapter, Massachusetts, is a person named Charles Brooks, who is a Unitarian pastor. And as a Unitarian pastor, obviously religion is front and center in what he does every day. And it's very much front and center in his school reform as well. And it is why he's pushing for a state-sponsored teacher training college and the sort of secretary position that Horseman is going to step into. But while religion is a major part of his rhetoric and what he's doing, and I think part of his motivation, he's still wedding schools to religion in a way that's somewhat different than Gallaudet. I think for Gallaudet, it's really all about sharing the gospel, particularly with this person at first, and then expands to that. And I think Brooks has a slightly broader conception. But yeah, I think at the time, just religion was just an incredibly powerful force, and it was part of the air that people breathed and how they're approaching things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And you didn't mention, and I will be super brief with Joseph Lancaster, but Joseph Lancaster, not as public a name as Horace Mann either, but he is always described as the Quaker from London, and he used Quaker networks. This is why, it was Quaker networks in Philadelphia especially who really pushed this Lancastrian vision of schooling. And this is the 1820s, specifically for the poor, Black and white, boy and girl. The idea was that, Quaker, but other Protestants as well, that everybody needed the gospel, white and Black, free and unfree, boy and girl. Lancaster, when I started my research, I assumed he was going to be an earnest, maybe naive reformer, but he had a very instrumental view of Quakerism. He seemed earnest, don't get me wrong, but he, just as a person, he seemed to mostly think of what Quakerism could do for him, which is a hard thing to say if you're sincere. But We don't have to talk too much about Joseph Lancaster.
Well, Lancaster was a fascinating figure, and I mean, yeah, the first chapter of the book is about him, and I think he's often thinking about what things can do for him,
Yeah.
which is a problem for him, and people notice that, and it becomes really his downfall in lots of ways. But so yeah, I think you're absolutely correct that his Quakerism is something that he tries to use to his advantage, as he does with everything else. So I don't think he's necessarily particularly hypocritical in doing that. He may be hypocritical, but only because as a person, that's one of his significant weaknesses. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of what you thought before versus what you thought along the way. But if you were to have a time machine to 2009, and to predict this book compared to what it came out as, what do you think are the biggest surprises, the biggest changes that happened along your journey toward this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, so I mentioned sort of the scaling down of the book, and how I deal with fewer parts of it. The dissertation proposal even had a chapter on Canada, and I forget the figure there actually, but there was a significant Rylston, I should know this. There's someone doing similar things there too. So it certainly gets shorter. I don't think that when I started the book, I was not really so sort of the chronology that I've mapped out with religious reform powering the common school awakening up until a certain point at which it breaks down and then other factors come in. I think that chronology is really nice, and it's good and true, and that's why it's in the book. I didn't come in with that chronology in my mind at all. It shouldn't be a surprise that that's there, because it maps on, I think, with the evidence and also with broader historiography, but it wasn't something that occurred to me. I think I was just looking at these, I was just surprised that these early reformers were also religious and were looking abroad, and I was looking for things having to do with that. So that's been something that I've learned in the process, maybe. Yeah, and then I think there are some. So I mentioned how Gallaudet features prominently in the book. I think that's a surprise, and sort of the significance of deaf education for thinking about schooling and how it's approached as a whole in this era would not have been something that occurred to me before writing this book. But deaf education actually does provide a really helpful lens for understanding how people are thinking about education, Christianity, citizenship, and all of these questions. It's not just a sort of a fringe field. It's something that can actually inform major questions in American historiography.
Speaking of major questions, still right now, outside the Massachusetts State House in Boston, they have the statue, Horace Mann, and they have the plaque, father of, I don't even know what it says, but they use the word father. I don't know if it says public schools or common schools. Do you know?
I think it's public. I've got it on the inside cover here. Father of the American public school system is what it says.
All right. So for people who are generally knowledgeable about the history of schools, Mann does play this outsized role. Your book, again, doesn't ignore him, but if you had your druthers, what would you do? Would you take the statue down? Would you put another statue up next to it? Would you change the nameplate? Like, for people who aren't going to spend too much time learning about the Common School Revival, besides reading your great book, what's the takeaway about the sort of roots? Number one, well, let me try one. Number one, it is transatlantic. Okay. What else?
Yeah, I think so. I want the takeaway to be it's transatlantic and it's religious. Those are the two major arguments that you see in the subtitle of the book, which I think holds up. And I do think, at least for the broader historiography, I also want to change the timeline. I'm not sure that I'm personally too concerned about the statue. I'm not an iconoclast in that terms. We can leave it up there, whatever. But for scholars, I do think scholars should reframe man's significance, or at least look to other figures and to other impulses. So I do hope that scholars take that away from the book. Yeah, decentering man. If man wants to, if people want to keep man in the center of the public mind, I'm not. It doesn't bother me as much. But then again, yeah, then again, I'm more of a religious historian than an educational historian. So maybe if educational history was really what my primary interest was, maybe it'll be a little more important to me to change the public mind too. What do you think? I guess you're a little more.
Well, the phrase that I'm using in my Lancaster book is that man and his generation, and the phrase is surprisingly resilient. Lawrence Kremen uses it without quotation marks, fathers of American public education. The Horace Manns, the Henry Barnards, the Calvin Stows. Yeah. Kremen, and this is writing in the 1960s, just says this generation are the fathers. And then Carl Kasell in the 80s, 70s, 80s, he calls them the fathers. He uses quotation marks around the term, but he still uses the term. I am with you there. This generation, I think we need to get rid of this fathers first of all, but maybe creators. There's no doubt, and Carl Kasell wouldn't say that they're this either, and this is why I use the quotation marks. They're not creators of the common schools by any means. They are, in my opinion, they are fixers, they are tweakers, they are expanders. But it's certainly in urban areas, certainly in the Northeast, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, New Haven, but even in places like Virginia, as you mentioned, the puzzles of the common school in terms of tax funding, in terms of tuition payments, those are figured out in the first few decades. People like Horace Mann, Henry Barnard, they systematize, they expand, but they don't create. So my joke in my own head is father of the public school, Horace Mann, only if you mean it in the very funny sense, which I don't think anyone is how they mean it, is that like the father in the sense of the like dad joke father, like claims credit for stuff that was already there, uses a lot of duct tape to fix things that were basically created before. So if that's what you mean by father, then yeah. But that's clearly, obviously not what people mean. So I'm with you. I think that the generation weren't creators. They were fixers, duct tapers, expanders, and successfully and importantly so. All right. So what about what's still out there? You mentioned Virginia had to get moved to a smaller role. Canada had to get cut. So what if you had the ability to do the Common School Awakening 2, what do you think you would want to expand on? What's the first place you would look for mysteries that still puzzle you?
So I think I mentioned Virginia. One could do Canada. I think more attention even in the book. This is the book's been positively reviewed, which I've been grateful for. One of the not criticisms, but one of the comments that I've received is that I could have had people say I do pay attention to people who are not Caucasian and white. I could pay more attention. I think that's true. I did work on including African Americans in the story, but unfortunately they're sort of there because the major reformers are excluding them. I still think there's probably more that could be done with that, and it is in there, but it could be expanded. It's in there, especially in the Ohio chapter. There could be more in Massachusetts. There have been a few good books that have come out even since the dissertation. So I was able to incorporate them into revisions as I was writing the book, but they're not as foundational as they could be, perhaps. So I think that's one of the areas where more could be done. And I think just there are other sort of case studies. I think this is a book of case studies, but you're writing a book on Lancaster, and there can be a whole book on Lancaster, and there can be a book on other figures. I also had a chapter on Pennsylvania mapped out early on with Girard College, I think it's called, which there could be certainly an essay on that, which I've thought about writing at some point in time, probably won't get around to, and maybe more, maybe be a book. So there's lots of places here that can be expanded, I think.
Yeah, and if I could just also, for example, we talk about the Common School Awakening, this Common School movement as a K-12 story, but we know that it's also a teacher training story, like essentially at its very core.
Yes.
So I think this false distinction between what is now K-12 and quote, higher ed, tertiary ed, it just doesn't make any sense. And you can't talk about, and this is certainly the case with Lancaster. Lancaster was a monster, and he was a greedy monster. And one of his, as soon as he realized that there was money to be made in teacher training, he saw that quickly, and he quickly asserted exclusive rights to certify in order, to give certificates, literal certificates, to people that he thought only available through him were qualified to become Lancastrian school teachers. So, I think this, I think a lot of historians since Carl Castle have done a great job of always emphasizing that, like, public, private, those distinctions that we have don't make any sense in the 1800s. Even secular, religious, no, not our distinctions. People argued about those things, but in different terms. And I think we should do a similar thing with K-12 and higher ed. We assume that they're different stories with different histories, but it's really, the Common School Awakeners were as interested in the souls of the teachers as in the students. And in their minds, the two were inextricably linked. You needed Christian teachers to have Christian students. And you needed Christian students to grow into Christian teachers. So I think that's one more thing that I would love to see more of is, early 1800s examination of the entire thing together. It's not just about children. Well, it is. Often college was for 14-year-olds. Right. So I would love to see more integrated stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah, my book is still fundamentally a book about how we get pedagogies and how we get laws. And so it's still, while I'm arguing that we get pedagogies and laws from common people, normal people who are advocating for them, it's still in some sense sort of a story of the elite. But that needs to be expanded, absolutely. And not just how we get the pedagogies, but what are the pedagogies actually doing on the ground for the people who are using them, people who are learning them, and that can be done at on all the levels. So I've helped us understand how we get teacher training schools, but what happens in those schools? There's a lot more work to be done there too.
All right, I've got one more, and then but before we get to it, what else can you share about this journey? So, for example, if you were to talk about your book historiographically, what do you think is something that you include that hasn't really shown up in enough depth before? So
I think so. The historiography of American education is really just fascinating. From this, as you progress from sort of Cubberley to the revisionists and then to what's happening today, I think I stand pretty firmly in the mainstream educational historians occurring right now, which is pushing back against the revisionists a little bit, while I still want to acknowledge that there's helpful things going on there. But I think I'm still bringing helpful correctives to that revisionist narrative that I think still is, if not the dominant one today, is still the one that needs to be reckoned with today. And there's the quote in the Michael Katz book where he explicitly says that politics, religion, and other countries have been overemphasized in previous history, and so he's going to ignore them. And that's fine for history, we're all in a conversation, and conversations go back and forth. but those things were then ignored for far too long.
Mhm.
And those things actually did matter, and we need to bring them back, and pay attention to them. And I think that's the major contribution, is to look at laws, and to look at how we got them, and to recognize that religion played a major role, and transatlantic influences played a major role. And from my field of educational history, or sorry, my field of religion, which is really my primary training, where I do most of my work, religious scholars are using education more and more. But I still think there's a little more work for educational scholars to do, to pay attention to religion. I think you're the best person out there doing that, which is why I wanted to talk to you with the interview. But I think there's a lot more going on here, and I hope the book inspires people to continue to think along those lines.
Yeah, well, thank you. But also, you mentioned Daniel Rogers' Atlantic Crossings. I know for me, one of the books that got me started a million years ago, looking at especially conservative evangelical Protestants and school, was George Marsden's originally 1980 and then 2006 Fundamentalism in American Culture. And it was a big deal for me. I read the book in my graduate work in Wisconsin. It sort of started me on this journey. And then honestly, I put it away for a while. And I came back to it in the new edition, the 2006 edition, and I was very different. And my experience with it was very different. It's a great book, and it's in my opinion, people have talked, as you mentioned, maybe it needs to include more non-white evangelicals. Okay, maybe, but it's such a beautiful, powerful book. But my reading of it was different, 15 years later. Would it be Atlantic Crossings for you, or is there a different book that kind of started you out that you think if you read it now, you'd be in a different place and able to think about it differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I think as far as this particular project, Atlantic Crossings clearly had the biggest impact on launching me in this direction. Are there, yeah, other books that are clearly really important? I think Cubberley is really interesting. I think Cubberley's been, I think someone should pay a little more attention to him again. There was a book a long time ago, The Wonderful World of Elwood Cubberley, and his book's quite helpful, if only because of the facts that are in it. And I use the facts in this book a lot. So I don't want to revive his vision of how schools, his larger agenda is not my agenda. But I think the book's helpful for the facts, and I used it for the facts. It'd be interesting to revisit it again and think about it, having then written this. Yeah, and then the revisionist historians obviously are significant, but I'm not sure that. I think they're just saying they're telling a different story than I am. I'm not sure. I had to change their story based on what I've done.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I got my eye on the clock. What else before we close? Do you think people who don't know your work they should rush out and get it right now?
Yeah, I hope people can enjoy the book. I think I think it's telling an important story. I think it's well written. I really tried hard on the prose. I mentioned earlier that I defended in 2015. I was published in 2020, and I spent basically the 5 years polishing the prose while teaching and having kids. But still, I hope people can enjoy reading it and learning from it.
And I'll add in, I'd say for everybody who, not just in people interested in sort of the history of the growth of public schools, which this book is absolutely vital for everyone in that field, but even for people who are more focused in history of childhood, this story is a really vital way. It tells a vital story about the way school reformers, the unquestioned assumptions that they made about what it meant to be a young person. And in their head, that definition was changing, and they were keeping up, and they were making modern, cutting edge reforms because they thought of themselves as sort of having a new and better understanding of what the child was, what a child was, what children needed to flourish in schools. Okay, well, it's been a real pleasure talking about the book. Again, it's Common School Awakening 2020, Oxford University Press. It's a great book.
Thanks so much for talking. I really enjoyed it.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.